Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming along to this first of 3 online webinars, just to do a bit of a catch-up on all of the information that we've shared over the last 4 years and really get ready for our trip up to Cocos, Keeling Islands in April. Just if you are a new player, we are talking about the Cocos Keeling Islands Coastal Hazard Risk Management and Adaptation Plan. This is brought to you with a partnership through the Australian Government, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communication and the Arts, in partnership with WA Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage and the Shire of Cocos Keeling Islands. You will see from the draft documents that we also have a series of other people that we've engaged with, including Water Corporation, Department of Transport, etc. So those are the sorts of people that we've engaged along the way here. So welcome and thank you for watching this video or attending this session. The purpose of the study, a Coastal Hazard Risk Management Adaptation Plan, or a CHRMAP, for the Cocos Keeling Islands is what we're talking about today. And this presentation is trying to explain what a CHRMAP is. It's not going to talk about the actual draft recommendations that we have in the advertised version. It will talk simply about the process to get there. Okay, so what is a CHRMAP? A CHRMAP is a strategic document to plan for responding to coastal hazard challenges if or when they happen. So it's looking at identifying risks and vulnerability, and then it identifies the assets that are valued. And so those two things are a bit of a pairing of what might be happening and what is valued in those locations where it might be happening. It recognises and seeks to preserve community values if possible, recognising that values can change over time, and informs community and decision makers to help future planning. You'll see through the process of this presentation that future planning is over a very long time frame, and the decision making can happen in the short, medium, long term, and in fact, in some cases, in the very long term, or in fact, in the really immediate term. For our purposes, and I'll explain how this happens, it's required under WA State Planning Policy 2.6, which is the State Coastal Planning Policy. It's essentially required whenever we're considering development and where people will live and how safe they will be on the coast in Western Australia. It's a plan for 100 years, so we're looking at a 100-year overall timeframe for such a plan. So why are we talking about the West Australian Government and why State Planning Policy 2.6 applies? In CKI, if you aren't already aware, the West Australian planning legislation is applied law on CKI. Under that applied law, the WA Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage provides support to the Indian Ocean Territories under service delivery agreements or arrangements with the Commonwealth Government. So the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, or DPLH, is responsible for delivering on state planning policy, in this case 2.6, State Coastal Planning Policy, which looks at vulnerability of populations, so life and safety, perhaps the most critical issue affecting the future sustainability of human settlement on CKI. And of course, then we have the process of doing a CHRMAP under those guidelines. This is a required pathway, so this is very clearly defined under the state planning policy and it's supporting CHRMAP guidelines. It is a continuous cycle with ongoing review being a critical component. And once complete, action can begin, including planning, monitoring and funding outcomes. You can see it's a 7-stage task, starting with essentially establishing the context, which is understanding the existing conditions, then looking into the risk identification, vulnerability analysis, risk evaluation, which is what does all of that mean, and we'll go into that a little bit more. Risk treatment, so what could we do? And then implementation and monitoring and review. So it's a 7-stage process to get to a draft CHRMAP, which is what we're looking at on CKI at the moment. But that 7-stage process is not the end of the process of coastal hazard planning, because once we get to the end of it, we virtually start again. And essentially what we're looking at is that monitoring of actual impacts helps trigger the decisions that are suggested. Decision makers can respond appropriately when needed. So what this is trying to do is give us a plan so that decision makers have got the right information to make the decisions when they need to. And those decisions can vary depending on the impacts that we are observing. As I said, it starts again. So in the case of CKI, the current recommendation is that this process is followed every 5 years. The reason for that is because the impacts that have been observed are already quite significant, and because we can see that a number of people's lives, livelihoods, properties, etc., are potentially impacted in the current day. So the need to review it more regularly is much greater on CKI. But this little section just talks about how a CHRMAP identifies risk and vulnerability. So it predicts the risk of erosion and inundation, and I'll talk about those in a moment, and adds predicted sea level rise, which I'll also refer to shortly. It identifies the likelihood of exposure on an asset. And so just to sort of unpack the word asset, how likely is it that the coastline will erode and impact, say, a park or a house or the office or a pond dock? So that's what an asset would be. Something like a park would be an asset as much as a house would be an asset, a beach would be an asset, etc. Then it looks at identifying the consequence of what happens if that asset is exposed to that risk. So, for example, the house is damaged but can be repaired, or the house is partially damaged permanently, or the house is lost entirely. So those are different levels of consequence. And then it considers the adaptability of the asset, so whether the impact is acceptable, whether the impact can be managed, whether the impact is unacceptable and the asset can't adapt in any way that retains its existing value. A lot of this is considering impacts on the current experience and use and value and appreciation of an asset. So sometimes the asset can be impacted, but it doesn't necessarily change the asset's use, i.e. the impact is acceptable. And then in other scenarios, we're talking about fundamental unacceptable impact. And then the CHRMAP makes recommendations for how to respond to the long term. And I think it's really important that we say in this moment that when the CHRMAP is making recommendations, some of those are predictions are based on the science that I'm about to share with you. And the CHRMAP is cognizant and respects the fact that some of those predictions might in fact change. And so back to an earlier slide where we talked about monitoring. Monitoring becomes one of the really significant recommendations of any CHRMAP, to follow what's actually happening on site and to see if it is in fact changing the way that the prediction said it would. So even when we make a recommendation in the CHRMAP, it's sort of overridden by the need to assess that in a consistent and ongoing fashion to make sure that we are actually following the actual change as opposed to what's predicted. So there's always a testing and monitoring and reviewing component to a CHRMAP, despite the recommendations. So let's talk about what makes up some of this study work. The first question, I guess, that I'll put into the discussion is, what is erosion and inundation? So erosion refers to shoreline movement where the shoreline shifts landward because of sediment being transported away by waves, winds and currents, reducing the width of the coastal foreshore reserve and the distance to an asset on the adjoining land. For anyone on Cocos, you know exactly what this looks like. It looks like the beach slowly disappearing, sometimes quickly disappearing into the ocean because of a storm, but other times, just over periods of time, the sand disappears and our beach gets a bit narrower, and any foreshore reserve, any parkland that we have adjacent to the beach gets a bit narrower. And a really obvious response to that you see over and over again on CKI is the sandbag seawalls. And so that's trying to hold the line from erosion. It's made up of three separate measurements. So the first, and again, it's predicted. So we have to keep sort of saying that the numbers are based on predictions with a combination of different values. But the first one is S1, the S1 allowance, which is the distance for absorbing acute erosion, including an extreme storm sequence. So that's erosion caused by a storm based on a modelled 100-year average recurrence interval storm. So a decent sort of a storm is modelled, sort of tested, and it's predicting the erosion that's caused by that storm. So that's what we call S1. The second one is S2. Now, S2 is very, very much based on historic trends. So S2 is the distance to allow for historic trends, so chronic erosion or accretion. Now, accretion being when more sand is deposited on the beach. And this is observed or monitored. And so there are different scenarios in different places on CKI where these things have been monitored, and other places where they've been observed through aerial photography or through local observations in some cases. But S2 is the distance to allow for historic trends, very much backwards looking. And the last one that we have in our erosion combination is the S3 allowance, which is a distance to allow for sea level change. The minimum requirement in State Planning Policy 2.6 is 0.4 of a metre in 50 years and 0.9 of a metre in 100 years. That's a bit of a simplification, but I will go through where those numbers come from. Essentially, the S3 is the big number, and the allowance for S3 increases over time. And I'll go into that now. So where does S3 come from? I guess the overarching science globally has been collated by an organisation that comes together regularly called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And the IPCC has been working on figures and data over a relatively long period of time. This image here is the IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate. I guess importantly, if you look at the historic trends from, say, the 1700s, that line might otherwise be going like this. But actually what's happened in the last 100 years is we've seen a fairly rapid uptick in the rate of sea level rise. And that's what's leading to this thing that you see here on the right of the page, which is the 2000 to 2100 numbers, which are suggesting that sea level will rise quite quickly. Essentially what that starts to look like over a longer period is a fairly significant increase in sea level rise. But I want to point out a couple of figures here, which is this RCP 2.6 and the RCP 8.5. And the reason they matter is because they determine sort of the lower prediction and the higher level predictions that we might be looking at as we go into the future. RCP 2.6 represents a low greenhouse gas emissions scenario, high mitigation future, and a 2 in 3 chance of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. So that's an optimistic prediction. And if we follow an optimistic prediction path, which is this lovely blue path, we see some increase in sea level, but it starts to mitigate beyond 2100 and it starts to flatten out. RCP 8.5 corresponds to the pathway with the highest greenhouse gas emission. And unfortunately, what it looks like is quite similar to what we are doing at the moment. So the RCP 8.5 is this red line, and it starts to look even more substantial beyond 2100. And for anyone who's seen the full graph, I've clipped off the 2200 to 2300 part of this because it's even more substantial. The variations between the lower and the higher predictions are based on a whole series of other things, including the different ice sheets that might melt in Greenland and Antarctica, and different mean sea level temperatures that might be experienced, amongst other things. So there's a few bits and bobs in the high to low variation there. So that's the big picture. That's the international assessment, and of course, what it's doing is predicting a mean across an international framework, so across the globe. So, how does that translate into our West Australian policy? In Western Australia, we undertook some work essentially to support the state planning policy. And there was a document prepared in 2010 called the Sea Level Change in Western Australia Application to Coastal Planning. It was completed by the Department of Transport in Western Australia at the Coastal Infrastructure Division. It references the fourth IPCC report, which is from 2007, which, as you can tell, is relatively outdated now, and a Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, that's CSIRO, report from 2007. And essentially what it does is it tries to chart what sea level rise should be considered as relevant for our state coastal planning policy 2.6. And this is where the 0.4 by 50 years and the 0.9 by 100 years number comes into play, because they're the figures on this slightly exponential graph here. That report recommended using a relatively high level conservative figure for sea level rise. And that was generally because there was a series of things that were hard to predict, and the rate of change in ice sheets were aiming towards or going towards the higher level of the median prediction. So it is a conservative number, which is also obviously why we continue to say it's a prediction, and we talk about things as monitoring, and we talk about making sure that we do all the right research and avoid making ad hoc decisions. The other thing that we look at, and this is particularly relevant for a CKI environment, is there's a few different rules that we consider, and the one that's quite relevant is this idea that when we look at a centimetre of rise in sea level, there's a rule called the Bruin Rule, which starts to look at what does that mean in terms of the land coming inland or the water coming inland. And it typically says that 1 centimetre of sea level rise will bring the water 1 metre further landward. That's particularly relevant when we've got low-lying islands, such as we have on CKI, because it starts to provide us with information about how we need to manage that sea level rise if we are going to protect assets. Or in case we have other reasons or other recommendations to follow where we need to take action to protect people from within that zone of influence. So let's just jump to inundation. So inundation has only got one rule that we follow. I'll share that with you in a moment. So inundation essentially is referring to the flow of water onto previously dry land from the sea. It may either be temporary, so during a storm event, you might see some waves crashing onto the land and coming onto the islands, or it could be permanent. So if we see significant sea level rise, we might see land being more permanently inundated. Importantly, on CKI, it does not include circumstances where the groundwater sits at the surface of land and may be unable to infiltrate back into the soil. So some of the flooding that we already see, particularly on Home Island, is typically a result of stormwater and rainfall. And so we need to be really conscious that the inundation that we're talking about here is not referencing the high levels of groundwater that you see after a big rainfall event. So inundation is predicted based on our S4 allowance. So this is our S1, S2 and S3 for erosion and S4 for coastal inundation. And this one's a bit of a mouthful. It's the potential effects of an event with an annual encounter probability of 0.2% per year, which is equivalent to an inundation event with an average recurrence interval of 500 years. So it's a big event that we don't expect to see often. It's a 0.2% per year kind of event, but it doesn't mean it can't be. It doesn't mean it couldn't be observed now. And of course, when you start to consider sea level rise, the likelihood of some of those events increases over time. So they're the two biggies that go into some of the lines that you might have seen if you've had a look at the draft CHRMAP. If this is not the first time you've heard any of our presentation material, but now I'm going to go through a few of the other things that get considered in the CHRMAP process. So obviously cyclones and waves. So the region experiences tropical cyclones, about 2 to 3 per year. Extreme wave events occur which impact both the ocean-facing sides of the islands. And the local wave climate includes local sea waves produced by winds predominantly from the east, and swell waves from storms in the Indian Ocean, predominantly from the southwest. Although we are hearing from local experience that some of those storm events and wave experiences are actually perhaps changing direction, not all the time, but occasionally. So that's absolutely something that as the studies go forward and we continue to review information up on Cocos, the researchers would continue to look at. So tides and currents, CKI typically has 2 high tides and 2 low tides per day. Mean sea level varies on a monthly timescale. So sea level rise will also increase mean sea levels over time. And as I said before, the DOT, the Department of Transport, recommends the following sea level rises be used for planning. So the 0.4 and the 0.9, different timeframes as we go forward. The currents and circulation within the lagoon are driven by waves, wind and tides. I think it is really important to understand that quite often we are talking about mean sea level rise, and it does change over a monthly cycle, and it can change over annual cycles as well. What we are chasing is not does it go a bit higher for a while and then come back down. What we're looking at is longer term trends. So all of these studies are looking at long term trends, not sort of 4 or 5 year periods. The other thing which I think becomes really important when we're talking about the islands, and which lots of people have talked to us about up there, is the sand movement and erosion of sand circulating around the islands, because it does on occasion pick itself up from one beach and land on another beach. And so it can be a bit confusing to talk about erosion all by itself without acknowledging that sand is always moving, and sometimes it does its own job of moving itself around. I guess typically what we're observing, if we look at both Home and West Island, you can see the arrows on those maps. Sand is moving in different directions predominantly, and it finds different points where it either stops or and then switches direction, or it stops and deposits. And a good example of that is this area here in West Island, and these areas too here on Home Island, where there is some sand deposition, so depositing sand. A lot of these processes, so the longshore processes, are driven by waves and currents, and obviously erosion's occurring where there's more sand leaving an area than there is arriving. But there is also impacts, so tidal processes, so flood and ebb tides drive circulation within the lagoon, and sea level rise can increase erosion by changing wave heights and patterns in the ocean shorelines and changing the lagoon circulation. Coastal structures, such as seawalls, which you have a lot of, can also impact sand movement. For example, a seawall can stop shoreline erosion, but may result in loss of beach in front and lead to the scour at the ends of the seawall. So we do also need to consider when we're developing protect structures, what is the impact of the protect structure itself. A few other things that we are going to look at when we look at the research. We'll look at the elevation of the islands. This is a map which indicates where the highest points on the island. You can see that there's some slightly higher points on West Island, and there's some slightly higher points around South Island, and that extent of those of the area down this way, the southeast part of the atoll. We can see the majority of the islands in the northeastern side of the atoll, including Home Island, having relatively low elevation. And that's sort of obviously one of the reasons why we know that Home Island is more vulnerable at the current day than West Island is. Overtopping. Now, overtopping simply means when we have storms, does the ocean come over the top of those, the edges of the island? And so we see in the models a fairly significant, that would be the more red zones, a fairly significant amount of overtopping as we get to 0.4 metres sea level rise, and then even greater overtopping when we get to 0.9 metres sea level rise. I should just mention that these numbers here, 2068 and 2118, don't marry with the current numbers that we're using in the draft CHRMAP, essentially because, we talk about 100 years from today, we're talking really 2125, but the documents are actually referring back to 2018 as the date of the coastal vulnerability study, so I will refer to that in a moment. But that's why it doesn't sort of match when we say 100 years. 2118 is not 100 years from today. It's 100 years from when the coastal vulnerability study was complete. So that's just a piece of content that we should share with you as we go on with those numbers. Don't quite marry up with 100 years from 2025. There's also some other work that's been done in the Indian Ocean that's mapped the islands in a three-dimensional scale, and so some of those considerations have gone into the modelling. It's also kind of a fun and interesting map as well of what it looks like under the water over there. And then there is a sort of quite a different element associated with the atoll environment. So, as I said before, there's different things contributing to the assessment in different parts of the island. On the lagoon side, extreme water levels are driven by short-term wind waves and cyclone events. And on the ocean side, it's driven by offshore waves travelling across the reef, causing wave setup, which is essentially waves jumping on top of each other and run up to produce elevated water levels and flooding. So I guess what that's looking like from the outside of the island, if you look at the diagram at the bottom, creating big waves over longer periods and then potentially overtopping on the ocean-facing coastline. And then on the lagoon, smaller waves, but still being pushed into the island on the lagoon-facing shorelines. Now, if we jump into, I guess, where we've come from, the main piece of documentation that the draft CHRMAP bases itself on is this piece of work, and this is where you'll see that 2018 reference, which is the CKI Coastal Vulnerability Study. So the Cocos Keeling Islands Coastal Vulnerability Study commenced in 2019 for Home Island and West Island, based on some mapping and some assessments done slightly earlier than that. And it was undertaken by Royal Haskoning DHV. There's some supporting work with Blue Coast Engineering. So quite a few fairly internationally recognised engineers were involved in that phase of this project. And of course, they undertook it in accordance with the requirements of SVP 2.6 and the CHRMAP guidelines. It was complete in 2021, but again, just reminding you that mapping was done earlier, so we continue to refer to, I guess, current day in the mapping was 2018. I know that's a bit confusing, but we'd have to keep redoing the mapping if we wanted to change the date. Essentially, the Coastal Vulnerability Study identifies present and potential future coastal hazard risks and assesses the vulnerability of built and natural assets to erosion and inundation. So the basis for the draft CHRMAP is this relatively large document. This document is available on the project website, so you can access it. It's pretty hefty. Volume 2 has all the maps in it, so you can have a look at those anytime you want. Before that, though, a whole series of different companies were also involved in other supporting studies. So hydrographic surveys, long-term wind data, long-term tide data, topographic, LIDAR data, which survey data, Met Ocean data, and obviously the Coastal Vulnerability Study. There was a climate change risk assessment done for the Indian Ocean territories. There was some sand management strategies and modelling reports, the Crown Land Management Plan for the Indian Ocean territories, et cetera, et cetera. So there is no shortage of background research to the draft CHRMAP process. So you can see down the bottom just a list of some of the organisations that have been involved in doing research and background reporting for the CKI environment. I think one thing I probably should say before I jump to really our last few slides, which are saying so what for CKI, what does this mean for CKI, is nearly all of the research has been done on the inhabited islands. Some of the mapping that we can show you, which is associated with the other islands in the atoll, is based on like a comparison. So if we look at the overtopping maps or we look at the elevation maps, they are done based on the height that we can see on those other islands. But the vulnerability work is done quite specifically on Home and West Island. What that means is we do have to extrapolate the thinking a little bit to the other islands in the atoll. And so when we talk about what's at risk and vulnerable on Home and West Island, and you start to have a look at the potential impacts to Home and West Island, you may be able to yourself have a sort of a generic assessment of what it might look like in the on any of the other islands. So let's jump into the conclusions of all of the previous work. This should be of no surprise to anybody on CKI, but the islands are one of the most vulnerable coastal types to sea level rise. The coastal vulnerability study shows risk and vulnerability are already high to very high for multiple assets. And essentially high and very high are the top of the risk and vulnerability rating scale when we get to the CHRMAP process. Those are the assets that are reaching a level of intolerable risk to life, to safety, to looking after the health of communities, etc. For in general, in terms of the landforms and settlement, the shoreline is divided into ocean shores that occur around the perimeter of the atoll and face the ocean open, and lagoon shores that flank the lagoon. The fringing coral reef, which surrounds all of the CKI lagoon, obviously is a really important feature of how the waves reach the shore. And of course, they're quite important, and it would be amazing if they were to continue to grow and increase in elevation as the sea level rose. That's something that will continue to be studied to see if it's at all possible, but it's not a certainty. But the other thing that sort of becomes quite important is the breaks in the reef at Port Refuge and Western Entrance. And these let quite a bit of wave activity, a responsiveness to the ocean and what it's doing during storms, etc., into the lagoon. And so that's relatively significant in terms of what's happening on the lagoon side of the two islands. The two inhabited islands, I should say. Again, anything that impacts Home and West Island from the lagoon side will also impact all of these other islands, even though we haven't studied them. And the same for the coast-facing shorelines. Anything that impacts West and Home Island will have similar impacts along the other coastal foreshores. In terms of direct impacts on Home Island is low-lying, which you can see from the elevation plans that we showed earlier. It's susceptible to coastal flooding, especially the foreshore adjacent to the lagoon, which is obviously one of the reasons why you've already got some measures there to protect the island. Most shorelines on Home Island have been stable, and infrastructure on the ocean coast is reasonably set back in most locations. One of the challenges, and which remains a challenge, is that the previous studies clearly note that groundwater and rainfall flooding needs to be properly understood. And the process of developing the draft CHRMAP has pushed the recommendation for continued investigation of groundwater and flooding issues. And there is a study in train now to understand that better, particularly as it interacts with the potential for inundation and erosion that's been researched in the CHRMAP. And obviously we can see some of the things that have already been implemented to try and manage some of the coastal hazards that we can see on Home Island. Whilst, in this image here, trying to retain some of those local values of being able to get the boats into the water and really accessing the ocean. On West Island, it's a slightly different scenario. The development along the ocean coast has a very narrow foreshore buffer. And as of our trip in January, it looked quite a bit narrower than when we first studied this process. The island has a history of chronic erosion. We can see that because we can see all the seawalls that have been constructed, and they've been constructed as long back as the 1970s. The ocean-facing coastline is much more vulnerable than the ocean-facing coastline of Home Island, but the lagoon-facing coastline of West Island is less vulnerable than the lagoon-facing coastline of Home Island, just by virtue of the distance, the setback distances, and the level of the land on West Island. And a good reminder to everybody about the level of land on each of the islands is that the cyclone shelter on Home Island, the ground floor of that, which is up the steps, is the same level as the cyclone shelter on West Island, which is essentially sitting on the ground. So those two buildings have the same floor level, but one is up quite a few sets of stairs. So that's just a good, I guess, you can get your measure if you're on the island of the variation there. Obviously, we can see on West Island a couple of different solutions. The sandbags are typically employed because they're quite easy to implement on the islands. You have access to some sand, you have access to the bags and the equipment to build it. And what that means is if there is an urgent need to protect a section of coastline, they can be implemented. Obviously, some of them have been in there for quite a long time. So even though we might call them temporary, they have been doing a much more longer term job. But then we can look at something a little bit more like the wall in the southern area of the settlement on West Island, which we refer to generally as a CB seawall, that was constructed locally and installed locally, which is a much more rigid structure. It's been designed to try and help the waves dissipate when they hit the structure, but it is much more rigid than, say, the sandbags. But for that reason, it also holds in place a bit better, and you can see the difference when we have a big storm and we lose some of the sandbags at the bottom of the walls during storms. So to wrap this up, which is again one of 3 webinars just to deal with background information, the CHRMAP on CKI has followed 3 key phases, which moves into, I guess, the second part of the third phase shortly. The first was the coastal vulnerability study, which assessed and predicted long-term change. So that was sort of the using all the previous studies and research, looking at and predicting long-term change. Again, using the state planning policy pathway. The second phase, which we are well and truly in at the moment, is the CHRMAP, which looks at the values of the community, looks at vulnerability and potential options for adaptation. And then you go into the third phase. Now, the third phase, if we look purely at the CHRMAP, the third phase is about monitoring and funding of recommendations. So prioritising short-term and urgent actions that we can make with relative confidence, additional research such as groundwater studies, etc. But also monitoring some of the real-world situations on site. So what is really happening with erosion? How is the coastline changing in real numbers as opposed to the predictions that we're working from when we do the CHRMAP process? And so that's one part of it. And the second part, which is, I guess, beyond the pure CHRMAP world, but is really quite critical, is looking at how the local government planning system and, in fact, other policy levers respond to the CHRMAP. And that starts to look much more at the medium to long-term actions. It's really important to get that right in a planning sense, so that we don't make bad decisions about where to put more assets, which is something that we would want to avoid, is putting the wrong thing in the wrong place. in summary, a CHRMAP is a tool to guide decision-making. So it can make recommendations, it can direct different actions, but essentially it's a tool to help us make decisions over time. Nearly all of the actions that are implemented, that are recommended in it, are flexible. Most of them require other decisions to be made after further information, data or actual effects are more certain. So again, really, really important that we are following the data and really monitoring what's actually happening on site to make sure that we make good decisions. And that's why it's flexible, so that we can respond to what we're actually seeing. The CHRMAP also helps determine who needs to contribute and be involved in long-term actions. So who in the community will be involved in really stepping out the stages of the plans, who will be involved in some of the additional research, and who might pay for that work to be done. And it also helps funding partners understand where to focus expenditure. So the more urgent the action, the greater level of focus funding partners can place on funding that particular action. So it's a really important tool to seek funding. And I guess fundamentally what the CHRMAP is trying to do is to avoid ad hoc or ineffective adaptation, which would be making a quick decision that turns into a really bad long-term decision. So trying to make sure that we don't put something in place today that will either stop us putting something better in place tomorrow, or will exacerbate the problem to other people or to other areas of the islands. So all of those become really important. Okay, so that's it. We're at the end of it. So more information. So if you are chasing more information about the process and the pathway, there is lots of data involved on the project website. If you have registered already for this webinar series, you'll get a link to that after this meeting, but also anybody who's already registered to be engaged in the process will receive an email to remind you this presentation is available. Our next presentation, which is next Tuesday at the same time, we'll actually look at the adaptation options for coastal management. So all of the adaptation options that we look at, our coastal engineer will be with me for that meeting to present some of those options and to deal with the second dot point, which is what is effective and ineffective for CKI. So there's been quite a lot of work done in coral atoll environments. There's been quite a lot of work done in general island environments and in coastal areas to identify what types of adaptation options work in different locations. So Annabelle Sandry will be involved in our next 2 webinars to help with that work. And then obviously the last thing that we'll talk about next Tuesday is how the adaptation options that make it into the CHRMAP are developed. So what is the process for us determining what should make it to the next step, which is to be one of the recommendations of the CHRMAP. Beyond that, we will get into much greater detail about the recommendations. So webinar 3 will talk about much greater details about the recommendations and then what next. So I hope you can join us for those. We look forward to getting any feedback and comments once you've had a chance to rewatch this video and check out the information on the background. So from the project team, thank you, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.